Hi guys, Merry Christmas. Today I have a very special present for you. It's a free book and you can download an electronic copy at theccf.ca/12 days of POEC. It's a Christmas themed book about the 12 wildest and craziest things that happened at the Public Order Emergency Commission. Now, in this video, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what those 12 things were, and since we're giving away a free copy, you should probably take a second now just to pause this video, go download it, and come right back. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Christine, and I'm the Litigation Director for the Canadian Constitution Foundation, a legal charity that fights for fundamental freedoms in Canada. I upload regular videos about our ongoing cases and about other interesting developments in constitutional law in Canada. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, please hit like and subscribe below. It really helps my videos out a lot. Also, please remember, nothing in these videos is legal advice. If you have your own legal question or problem, please consult your own lawyer. So the Canadian Constitution Foundation participated in the Public Order Emergency Commission in their factual hearings as a party to the inquiry. As a legal charity that fights for fundamental freedoms in the courts of law and public opinion, we provided a very valuable perspective in these hearings, and we were able to give opening and closing arguments and conduct cross-examinations. And these included cross-examinations of mid and top-level police, previously faceless senior government bureaucrats, and cabinet ministers all the way up to the Prime Minister. There are links to all of these cross-examinations on my channel, so you can check those out. I will leave links to those in the description below. The Public Order Emergency Commission hearings took place at the National Archives, which is sort of the bookend of Wellington Street in Ottawa, at the very edge of downtown, nestled among some of these big, hulking, concrete, bureaucratic buildings. Now, Ottawa in November is no vacation, and the CCF lawyers, including me, spent long weeks of that inquiry there. Now, bleak as it is, the setting of the archives is appropriate. The archives is just steps away from the Supreme Court, and it's actually on Wellington, the very same road that found itself gridlocked by the Freedom Convoy's big rig tractor trailers in January of 2022. Now, in this video and in the free book that I'm giving away, I'm going to go through some of the biggest takeaways from those factual hearings, the things that were revealed to us through some of the testimony of all of those key players. And since it's the holiday, the theme of the book is the 12 Days of Christmas, Public Order Emergency Commission edition. And I really hope you enjoy it, and I hope you especially enjoy that I'm not singing it for you. So on the first day of Christmas, the Public Order Emergency Commission gave to me a new and novel legal theory about the meaning of national security threat. The government has promoted what I would call a strange and novel legal argument intended to lower the threshold of when the powerful law, the Emergencies Act, can be used. This is, remember, a law designed to deal with wars, plagues, and terrorist attacks. The threshold for invoking the Emergencies Act for a public order emergency is a very high one, and that is plain in the text of the law itself. It requires the existence of a national security threat and defines that term to have the same meaning as the Emergencies Act definition for national security threat. Now, we've learned through the Public Order Emergency Commission from testimony from CSIS, the director, Michael Vigneault, that there was no national security threat according to CSIS. And that appears to have led the government to develop this new theory that the two thresholds are actually different. Now, the interpretation that the two thresholds are different actually runs counter to the text of the law itself. It runs counter to the standard principles of statutory interpretation and to the intention of Parliament as recorded in Hansard when Parliament enacted the Emergencies Act. Now, while the government has given us this new legal theory, they actually kind of cheated because they didn't actually give it to us. They've just told us that it exists. It would be kind of like if I brought my husband a snowblower for Christmas, but I didn't actually give it to him. I just told him, a snowblower exists, printed a picture of it, and said, look, there's a really great snowblower, but you can't actually have it. On the second day of Christmas, the Public Order Emergency Commission gave to me endless claims of privilege. Now, the government has relied on this novel legal theory about the threshold of national security threat under the Emergencies Act being different from under the CSIS Act, but they've actually refused to provide a copy of that legal opinion that lays out this theory. Justice Minister Lametti was cross-examined on this exact issue. We asked if the Prime Minister would waive privilege over this legal opinion, and they both said no. And this really puts the inquiry, the commission, in a bind because the opinion was relied upon by key decision makers and cited by key witnesses testifying at the inquiry, including the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, the head of Canada's spy agency, and the Minister of Finance as one of the reasons they decided they had authority to invoke the act. Their testimony suggested that this opinion laid out this interpretation of how the Emergencies Act could be invoked that runs counter to the normal standards of statutory interpretation. Now, the question about whether the threshold was met is a core task of this inquiry. It's the question that all of us who spent those weeks in Ottawa were there to answer. Was the federal government legally justified in invoking the act? And shielding the Department of Justice's legal theory upon which key decision makers relied could make the commission's job more challenging, if not impossible. Now, this was hardly the only claim of privilege that has been interfering with the inquiry's ability to do its job. The government made all kinds of redactions on inappropriate grounds, some of which were ordered unredacted by Commissioner Rouleau. For example, on the last day of the inquiry, the Prime Minister was being questioned by a lawyer for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms who pulled up a redacted document. It was notes from a call between political staff in the Prime Minister's office and U.S. American officials. The commissioner, though, had ordered the redaction removed. And underneath the black box, we saw what was written. The Americans had offered to send tow trucks to Canada to help clear the entrenched protesters. Now, this is really relevant because the lack of tow trucks was a partial justification for invoking the Emergencies Act. If tow trucks had been available by, for example, being lent to Canada from the United States, then the use of the Emergencies Act may not have been necessary. But we were receiving these unredacted documents so late, it was too late to put it to many of the relevant witnesses. So in that case, it had to be put to the Prime Minister. Now, another redaction related to the policing plan. The Prime Minister had testified on the last day of the fact-finding part of the inquiry that there was no what he called real policing plan to remove the Ottawa protesters. He said that the policing plan that had been presented by the command table, the Ottawa RCMP and OPP command table, before it was invoked, that plan was no plan at all. And he said, you should read it. Now, our lawyer pulled up the first page of that policing plan and showed it to the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister said, oh, well, I don't know what that is. I've never read that, which is strange because it was the first page of the policing plan, which he said he had read and wasn't any good. How would he know it was no good if he hadn't read it? Then we showed him the next few pages of that policing plan, which were completely blacked out. We asked him, you told us, Prime Minister, to read this plan. Would you agree that we cannot? And the Prime Minister said indeed. When we asked if he would waive privilege over that plan and let us read it as he'd instructed us to, through his counsel, he claimed privilege. On the third day of Christmas, the Public Order Emergency Commission gave to me the wild and incoherent claim that an economic threat can equal a national security threat. This was a bizarre claim made during the testimony of Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland. When we cross-examined Minister Freeland, we read her the definition of national security threat from the legislation, and we asked her if she would agree that under the text of the definition of national security threat, economic threat isn't there. Now, Minister Freeland evaded this question by responding that she believes that the government had authority to act under the Emergencies Act, and she believes it was the right decision. Not really an answer. But from our perspective, economic damage, economic harm is clearly not what was contemplated by the Emergencies Act. There are all kinds of things that can cause economic damage. Many of the federal and provincial government's policies during the pandemic caused economic damage since they quite literally shut down the economy. But that's not the same thing as terrorism, and it's not what is contemplated by the Emergencies Act as a national security threat. There was an excellent cross-examination by the Canadian Civil Liberties Association done by Eva Krajewski, which picked up on this theme of economic harm being a national security threat. Ms. Krajewska asked if civil disobedience will sometimes cause economic disruption, for example, in the case of general strike. Now, Minister Freeland objected to this comparison, and she said she did not agree with equating a general strike with border blockades. She was then asked about protests like Occupy Wall Street or Indigenous rail blockades. Those also caused economic damage. But Minister Freeland dismissed this and said economic damage of those types of protests are very limited compared to what we saw with the Freedom Convoy. Ms. Krajewska then asked Minister Freeland, wouldn't she agree that the right to protest encompasses more than simply standing on a patch of grass with a sign? Minister Freeland resisted, saying she's not going to try to draw the line right here during her testimony, but she said she does agree that in a democracy, we need to protect the right to protest, and that much is obvious. On the fourth day of Christmas, the Public Order Emergency Commission gave to me the convoy protesters' testimony about their frozen bank accounts. Now, there was a full week of testimony from the convoy protesters themselves, which included leaders of the protests and participants of the protests from different parts of Canada. Now, the protester witnesses had varying levels of credibility and coherence, with some being credible and forthright and others much less so. But what stood out most from their testimony was the impact of the government orders to freeze bank accounts. The orders under the Emergencies Act allowed not only for bank accounts to be frozen without a court order, but it also enabled federal and provincial governments to share information with financial institutions about individuals or entities funding the protests or blockades. That information could also be shared with the RCMP and with CSIS. And approximately 280 accounts were frozen, with most of them being targeted by the RCMP. Ordinarily, the freezing of bank accounts by government would require a court order, and generally, to otherwise freeze or seize assets would be an infringement of the charter-protected right to be free from an unreasonable search or seizure. Now, testimony from the protesters revealed that joint spousal bank accounts were frozen as a part of these account freezings. Protesters described how that impacted them. The spouses of some protesters who were not at the protests were unable to buy groceries. Some protesters testified that they were unable to buy necessary medication when their accounts were frozen. They were unable to make loan payments for things related to their businesses, which will have long-term repercussions. There were protesters who were unable to make child support payments. And there were protesters who also testified that if the goal of freezing their accounts was to force them to leave Ottawa, it actually made it harder since they had no money for travel. The freezing of bank accounts also could lead to long-term credit implications for people who were unable to make loan payments on time, and that's an additional punitive measure placed on these protesters. Now, in freezing the bank accounts of convoy protesters, Finance Canada bureaucrats testified that they did not intend to hurt the protesters' families and their ability to, for example, buy groceries or pay child support, but they did admit that ultimately that may have happened, and the testimony of the protesters was that it did happen. On the fifth day of Christmas, the Public Order Emergency Commission gave to me Tanks in the Streets, a text exchange between Lametti and Mendocino. One of the most revealing things at the inquiry was evidence of the frank and contemptuous text exchanges between senior politicians. And one of the most reported on exchanges was between Justice Minister Lametti and Public Safety Minister Marco Mendocino. By February 2nd, which was 6 days into the protests, Justice Minister Lametti had already escalated to mulling about the use of the military to address the protests. He wrote to Mendocino, "You need to get the police to move, and CAF if necessary." And CAF is Canadian Armed Forces. Mendocino replied, "How many tanks are you asking for?" And Lametti responded, "I reckon one will do." Now, on cross-examination, Lametti described the call for tanks as a joke, but the consideration about the possible use of the military to deal with domestic protesters was sincere, which is very disturbing since the military is trained for conflict, not for public order emergencies. And this kind of gallows humor also shows a rank contempt in Canada's ruling class for the convoy itself. On the 6th day of Christmas, the Public Order Emergency Commission gave to me RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki appearing to not know anything at all. Brenda Lucki is the commissioner of the RCMP, the top cop in Canada, and her lack of knowledge during her testimony at the Public Order Emergency Commission, either real or feigned, it was astounding. She was asked about, for example, the sequencing for Ottawa police requesting help from other forces like the RCMP or the OPP. Lucki testified that her understanding was that local requests for help from Ottawa police, for example, need to go to the OPP first, and then when that is exhausted, they can go to the RCMP. Now, this is not correct. The Police Services Act does not require municipal police like the Ottawa Police Services to first seek help from the OPP and then the RCMP. The text of the Act literally does not say this. Under the Act, the Ottawa Police could request help from both forces simultaneously. And even if the RCMP is not governed by the Police Services Act, you'd think that since all of this happened and the Ottawa requests for help from their forces were a major issue during the Freedom Convoy and throughout the testimony of this inquiry, you'd think that Lucki would have had a chance to look at the legislation. And all of this matters because if the RCMP could have supplied help earlier, then the Emergencies Act may not have been invoked. Other legal tools, like additional police resources, would have existed and could have helped to clear the protests. Now, we at the CCF also cross-examined Commissioner Lucki, partly about the frozen accounts, and just as a lead-up question, we asked Lucki to confirm that a court order is generally needed to freeze or seize assets, and Lucki claimed not to know this. By the way, it is required. It's extremely basic police knowledge to know that it's required. And lastly, we have the biggest thing that Lucki didn't know how to do, which is how to properly communicate very crucial information. Lucki had stated that the RCMP did not believe that all legal tools had been exhausted, which is part of the criteria for the Emergencies Act to be used. If other legal tools are available, the Emergencies Act cannot be used. So how did Lucki communicate this crucial information to Cabinet? By sending it as one line in a memo she sent to Mendicino's Chief of Staff. She didn't raise it directly with Mendicino. She didn't say it to the incident response group. She failed, in my opinion, in her duty to inform Cabinet. On the 7th day of Christmas, the Public Order Emergencies Commission gave to me the revelation that the feds were considering using the Emergencies Act as early as January. It's now clear that the Trudeau government was eyeing the Emergencies Act from the very beginning of these protests. Text transcripts revealed that Lametti, the Minister of Justice, asked his Chief of Staff on January 30th, the first weekend of the protests, whether there was a contingency for these trucks to be removed tomorrow or Tuesday. He asked, what normative authority do we have, or is some order needed? And then he wrote EA, Emergencies Act. Now, it's relevant that the federal government was considering the Emergencies Act this early because at this point, quite obviously, all legal tools had not been exhausted. On the 8th day of Christmas, the Public Order Emergency Commission gave to me the failures of the Ottawa Police. Now, the testimony at the inquiry revealed many failures by Ottawa Police, and it was the Ottawa Police, for example, who told the protesters to park on Wellington, including big rig trucks, which later became entrenched on Wellington and a big challenge to move. There was testimony from senior officers in the Ottawa Police and in the OPP that made Ottawa Police Chief Peter Slowly appear to be highly territorial and at times unwilling to collaborate with other levels of police. There was testimony from a senior member of the Ottawa Police Force who described Chief Slowly as saying that the OPP and RCMP who had been sent to Ottawa to help were in fact being controlled by their political masters, to quote Slowly. There was testimony that the Ottawa police originally didn't provide a full plan to other levels of police that would have laid out basic information about what officers from those forces that they were requesting for help would actually be doing in Ottawa. They described the request as just send us 1,800 officers without details about what they would do, where would they be sleeping, what they would be eating. And members of the other forces expressed concern that without a plan in place, police being taken away from their communities to just sit around in Ottawa wasn't good enough. We also heard testimony that the Ottawa police had failed to properly use their negotiating units, which could have been key in resolving the entrenched protest. On the 9th day of Christmas, the Public Order Emergency Commission gave to me tow trucks the day before the Emergencies Act was invoked. Now, tow trucks were key throughout these protests and named as one of the main reasons that the Emergencies Act was needed. And we learned that before the Emergencies Act was invoked on the 14th, there were already tow trucks that had arrived in Ottawa, and there were many more on their way. We also learned that American officials had offered the Prime Minister's office tow trucks, and that one of the key sticking points was not actually the availability of tow trucks, but compensation and indemnification for those tow trucks, which is a cost issue that could have been resolved with existing legal tools and without recourse to the Emergencies Act. On the 10th day of Christmas, the Public Order Emergency Commission gave to me a very bad false flag theory. Now, counsel for the protest organizers, Brendan Miller, at various points throughout his cross-examination, proposed this false flag theory. The theory related to the presence of and photographs taken of a protester in February who had been carrying a Nazi flag. Now, Miller's theory was that this man was not, in fact, a protester. He was actually a Liberal operative. Now, this theory was not persuasive for most observers, including me, who saw the motion materials related to this theory. And things only got worse. At one point, Miller ran down the hall of the archives, chasing after a bearded man that Miller seemed to believe was this false flag operative. He yelled after this man, asking if he would testify in the hearings, but the man was merely a spectator, and he turned around, replying confused, asking Miller, "Who do you think I am?" Miller was then later filmed saying, "Well, that's a hole in my case." Indeed. It's really a shame because Miller has a very important role, and I think up until then had been fairly effective in some of his cross-examinations, and he'd also come across as fairly likable. That is, until he was tossed out of the proceedings for continuing to interrupt Commissioner Rouleau on an oral motion that he had brought related to privilege claims. If you're going to allege a false flag theory, you need to be dead certain that it is true and have incredible evidence. And the appearance that Miller could not tell various bearded men apart when he is, in fact, a bearded man, well, that suggests that he wasn't so sure. But even more than that, even if the false flag theory was true, which I think is very unlikely, well, it seemed like the commissioner wasn't persuaded or interested. And if the judge isn't interested or persuaded, you should probably drop it. And finally, even if for some reason the commissioner was interested, the false flag theory ultimately is not really relevant to the purpose of the inquiry, which is the question of whether the threshold to invoke the act was met. So this was just a whole lot of wasted capital. On the 11th day of Christmas, the Public Order Emergency Commission gave to me the Prime Minister's failure to fully inform Cabinet. Prime Minister Trudeau testified on the last day of the factual hearings at the inquiry, and when we cross-examined him, we were interested in the line of question that we'd started about whether Cabinet was fully informed about a number of important things related to the Emergencies Act and the factual situation before they decided to invoke. The Prime Minister is the chair of Cabinet, and it's an important and serious responsibility. In our cross-examination, we learned that Cabinet had not been given a copy of that core, crucial legal opinion that showed the thinking behind this strange notion that the threshold for national security threat is different under the Emergencies Act than it is under the CSIS Act. This is something that needed vigorous debate at Cabinet, and we now know that Cabinet did not receive the legal opinion. The Prime Minister confirmed on cross-examination that instead they were briefed on it by Lametti, but they did not have the document itself. And this matters because the written opinion may have had, and likely did have, a list of the gaps and risks in that legal theory. That's typically what legal opinions do. We also learned that Cabinet did not receive a copy of the CSIS threat assessment that said there was no national security threat, and they did not receive a copy of the operational plan that was being developed by police, even a high-level copy of it. Now, this is important, again, because Cabinet needs vigorous debate, and Cabinet needs to be fully informed when making difficult decisions. In failing to provide all of this information to Cabinet, the Prime Minister failed in his role as chair of Cabinet and denied these decision makers relevant information that they needed to invoke the Act. On the 12th day of Christmas, the Public Order Emergency Commission gave to me an opportunity to reform the law. Now, the policy phase of the Public Order Emergency Commission came after the fact-finding phase, and expert legal scholars were called in to give their opinions about the Emergencies Act, and parties to the inquiry, like the CCF, were given an opportunity to submit proposals for reforming the legislation to improve it and to prevent future abuse. We submitted a number of recommendations, and some of them were, for example, creating a requirement that the federal government formally request provincial and territorial authorities use existing legal tools, including provincial and territorial emergency legislation, before the act can be triggered. We also recommended the creation of a parliamentary review committee to provide real-time oversight, the creation of a requirement that the government provide a full explanation of why existing legal tools fell short, the requirement of a supermajority to confirm a declaration of an emergency. We recommended the creation of a requirement that provinces confirm that there is a need for a declaration of an emergency. In this case, we learned that many of the provinces asked for it not to be invoked in their jurisdiction. We also recommended that the legality of the declaration of emergency be sent immediately to the Supreme Court of Canada instead of being sent to federal court. And we recommend broadening access to cabinet confidences and expediting judicial review of national security and cabinet privilege. So those are my 12 Days of Christmas Public Order Emergency Commission edition. The full report from the inquiry is due in February of 2023. But the Trudeau government's invocation of the emergency, it really is the gift that keeps on giving. There are also legal challenges that have been brought in federal court with similar questions about whether the threshold is met, including a challenge brought by us at the Canadian Constitution Foundation. We don't know yet what to expect from the final report, but it is really a monumental task for the commissioner to complete the report on such an expedited timeline. And we at the CCF wish him the best in his work and hope that he can enjoy his Christmas in spite of all these gifts to him and to all Canadians from the testimony at the inquiry. If you want to stay up to date about everything that we're doing in the inquiry and in that federal court case, you can subscribe to our Freedom Update emails at theccf.ca/freedom updates. And of course, don't forget to go and claim that free gift at theccf.ca/12 days of POEC. Thanks so much for watching, and Merry Christmas.